Well, good morning, everyone. As President of CEO and President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you all today. I'm Fred Kemp, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, U.S. Foreign Policy in the MENA region after the election. As you might well know, in these final, now less than 2 weeks ahead of our election, there's not much else we're talking about here in the United States, and I understand also in newspapers in Italy, it's been one of the leading stories. I'm delighted to be here with two gentlemen I respect deeply and count as friends, Ambassador Mussolo and Ambassador Vericchio, to kick off this important event. It's also a particular honor whenever General Jim Jones is involved in an Atlantic Council event. He is the only person other than General Brent Scowcroft to have served twice as the Atlantic Council chairman. Sadly, we lost General Scowcroft at age 95 in August, but his legacy is embodied by General Jones, who represents just the sort of nonpartisan, international, principled leadership of the Atlantic Council that we've always tried to champion. Since 2018, it's been an honor for the Atlantic Council, specifically the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, to partner with ISPI, the Institute for International Political Studies in Milan, and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on an annual conference and report tackling important issues in the MENA region and transatlantic relations. Despite the challenges that COVID-19 has presented us, we all wanted to continue this annual event in a virtual sense. We've learned during this year that there is geographic distance, but in many ways you can bridge the social distance for the time that we need to in this way. Because of the increasing challenges that COVID-19 poses to the region and the world, it's even more important than usual to convene such events. And the Council has been doing so since March of this year with unwavering commitment to being a platform for experts, analysts, and government officials to inform the public and the policy community on the issues that matter most. This event and the report that will be released later this month would not have been possible without the generous support from Fincantieri and ISPI. A special thank you goes to ISPI President Gianpiero Mussolo for his continuous collaboration and participation in our joint ventures. We're also indebted to the Italian Ministry, and in particular, the Italian Ambassador, His Excellency Armando Vericchio, for his unwavering drive to see our two institutions partnering on issues of high importance, not only to the two countries they represent, but also the whole international community. We don't like one-offs, and what we really love about this relationship is ISPI is such a serious partner. Obviously, the Foreign Ministry is such a serious partner, but we're not doing it 1 year or one time. We're building a relationship for the long term. This event represents one of several regional meetings ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation have been hosting as part of the 6th edition of the Mediterranean Dialogues. We're honored to host these important discussions, and I look forward to tuning in to the panels that will begin shortly after these introductions. Ambassador Mussolo is the president of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Early in his diplomatic career, he served in Moscow and Brussels. He has served in several high-ranking positions in the Italian government, such as Deputy Diplomatic Advisor to the Prime Minister, Deputy Secretary General to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In January 2006, he was appointed to the rank of ambassador. In 2007, he became Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the highest position in the Italian diplomatic career ladder. He has served as the personal representative of the Italian Prime Minister for various G8 and G20 meetings. And then finally, from 2012 to 16, he was the Director General of the Department for Intelligence and Security, the coordinating body of the Italian intelligence community. So incredibly rich career. I turn to him for advice and insight all the time. It is my, let's also include one more aspect of your biography. You are a member of the Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board, which we're very proud of. And with that, let me turn the microphone to my friend, Ambassador Mussolo.
Thank you very much, Chairman Kemp. Thank you very much, dear Fred. It's a great pleasure and an honor to me to be able to share with you this opening remarks. I pay tribute and I thank very much Ambassador Varicchio as well, the Italian ambassador in the US, and I turn also to General Jones to thanking him for his presence. It's quite an endeavor for EASP to keep pace with the Atlantic Council, because actually we are committed in what we are doing. We are very much convinced that there is an important role for think tanks to keep up awareness on what is happening in the world and to try to suggest possible ways and means to cope with what is happening in the world to our governments, to our institutions, and simply keeping people's attention on a high level with regard to this kind of phenomenon. But this is it is very difficult for EASP to keep pace with such a giant, with such a powerful organization as the Atlantic Council. So listening to you, Fred, listening to the kind words that you had towards EASP means that we are actually not doing that bad as we are concerned. And this, of course, makes me very proud of our cooperation and of chairing EASP. This event is a meaningful event because it's one of our virtual regional meetings that we actually traditionally take place ahead of the regular edition of MED. This year we came to the 6th edition of MED. MED is actually preceded and followed by regional events, making it a real whole year event actually. And we would tend to be also very, how can I say, presumptuous in saying that MED intention is to represent sort of a Munich Security Conference of the Mediterranean. And so to be able to do it with so many friends and brother institutes, it's only making our life easier. Once again, the challenge of MED this year is particularly difficult due to COVID. You pointed it very well out, but nevertheless, we kept on working on it, and it will start on the 25th November with some days of virtual events, and then on the 4th of December, there will be, in our ambition at least, and we hope that developments will allow to do it, a in-person day in Rome. We are also very pleased in working together with the Atlantic Council on a report, which is the impact of the pandemic in the politics of the Middle East and North Africa region. And it will be released and also presented at MED conference in December. Actually, many things have changed. I think that the most interesting feature here was this change of paradigm that the Trump administration brought into the Middle East reality. That's a switching back from what was Israel-Palestine priority in Middle Eastern politics to another priority, which is containing Iran. And making this a priority meant sort of a revolution in the system of relations in the Middle East, and brought to different alliances and innovative events. I'm of course referring to the Abraham deals, the Abraham agreements. This is a turning point, in my opinion, in the future developments in Middle East. Of course, we don't know, since we are in the Middle East and all things are changing rapidly, we don't know whether a future possible different administration will keep this kind of mindset, but we tend to think in ISP that I mean nothing will be reset as it was before. So the change of paradigm that the Trump administration brought in, for good and for bad, is something with which we will have to deal in the next years. And we do hope anyway that this would be able to represent a meaningful way forward, a way forward that would represent an improvement of what we for too many years was muddling through in the region. So this is all the more challenging for think tanks because it represents extra work of analysis, extra work of going into depth with this kind of phenomena. We are ready to do it. We hope to continue to do it with the Atlantic Council and also in the framework of MENA. So with this kind of intentions, I wish to thank you once again, dear Fred, the Atlantic Council, and look forward to seeing you soon in person and look forward to be able to testimony for a further successful edition of MED. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille, Mr. Ambassador Gian Piero. Thank you for those comments. I'm really glad you highlighted the Abraham Accords because I do think they are a game changer that's been a little bit underestimated in Europe, or at least parts of Europe and certainly in Brussels. And Vice President Biden himself has praised the agreement, so I do think the administration will continue, though I think with relationships, I'm sure in your conference today, our conference today, we'll talk about impact on the relations with Iran, impact the relations in Saudi Arabia. That I think there are some more questions. It's now my honor to turn to His Excellency Ambassador Verricchio, who has served as the Ambassador of Italy to the United States since March 2016. We're lucky in Washington in that our partners send us their best and their brightest. But that is true even more so in the case of Ambassador Verricchio. He's held so many high-ranking positions, both within the Italian government and abroad, that if I listed them all, we would never get underway. But let me just say that he specialized in European and transatlantic affairs during his years of Italian representation to the EU and the European Commission, ambassador to Belgrade, before that in Budapest during the dissolution of Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union, and then chief diplomatic advisor to a string of presidents on some of the most sensitive issues in international relations, with a particular focus on security affairs. So let me pass to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Fred, for your very, very kind introduction. It's my pleasure to renew this cooperation. As you said, very rightly so, we don't like one-off events. We enjoy continuity of our relationship, and certainly the one between the Atlantic Council, ISPI, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Embassy in Washington is one of the most effective. And I'm very also want to extend my greetings to my good friend, Gian Piero Mussolo, and to all those who have made this event possible. When we met last year, while discussing the many challenges of the MENA region, no one actually could have guessed that this year we would have been confronted with another overarching challenge, the pandemic caused by COVID-19. A real game changer that affected everyone's way of life across the world, in Italy, here in the States, and certainly throughout the Mediterranean. But now more than ever, it is possible, it is necessary rather, to look ahead and to try to redouble our efforts for a regional positive agenda. So this is why today's meeting is particularly fitting and timely. You know, Winston Churchill is credited for saying that the Balkans used to produce more history than they were actually able to digest. This is certainly true for the Mediterranean. Even in these very days when the world in a way was holding breath for the pandemic, so much continuously going on in the Mediterranean. Just to mention a few areas, the stabilization of Libya at the heart of the Mediterranean southern shore continues to be a top priority, a top security priority for the whole region. And it is crucial to support the UN effort to relaunch the intra-Libyan political dialogue. This is why I want to take this opportunity to express our appreciation to the acting special representative of the Secretary General, Stephanie Williams, because a window of opportunity is open that must be seized. We received in Italy the main leaders of the Libyan factions. As always, we continue to say that it is up to the Libyan people to try to find opportunities for the country to remain together. And this is why, together with the US, we are against any foreign interventions that might try to transform Libya into a battleground for a sort of proxy interested proxy wars. But when confronted by the serious economic crisis caused by the virus, we must also focus on how to make the most of all available resources to relaunch recovery in an inclusive manner. And certainly, energy comes to my mind in this case. Particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, energy provides an excellent opportunity for development and stability. Reducing tensions and promoting cooperation are critically necessary for unleashing the energy potential of the region. This is why Italy aims to be a leader in these patient negotiation efforts. We do think that we have a win-win opportunity for all. And as a founding member of the East Med Gas Forum, we do believe that this is a key in bringing together government as well as private companies. At the same time, we do not forget the threat that Daesh terrorism continues to pose. The recent appalling events in France testifies to the importance of our commitment against this cowardly enemy. But also our common challenge and our common endeavor to fight ISIS within the coalition is one of the remaining top priority of the Italian action. We aim to strengthen our role in supporting the Iraqi authorities, particularly with police training. You know, we were supposed to host in Naples the big event, a big meeting of the coalition back in June. That was not possible, unfortunately, but we stay committed to make sure that this global coalition remains the backbone of our shared fight against this terrible threat. But I would like also to mention a country which is always so dear to our heart, and it is embarked in a process of great transformation, and this is Lebanon. It is absolutely crucial that we continue to support the Lebanese people affected by a number of tragic events, including the one that hit Beirut on August 4th. Lebanon can really and has to be supported by all of us, by Italy, the US, the international community. Across the channel, as we say, just a few miles across Sicily, Tunisia is another country currently suffering from a severe new wave of pandemic and difficult economic crisis. I think that it is absolutely crucial to continue to provide our support. Fred you mentioned, and also Ambassador Mussolo recalled the importance of the Abraham Accord. This has been an historic development, showing that when there is political leadership, even in difficult times, it is possible to reach inconceivable goals. And I think that this is something that has to stay, and that we are particularly pleased that the Abraham Accord have been met with a bipartisan support in Washington. This is a legacy that whoever sits in Pennsylvania Avenue 1600 as of January 20th will be engaged to continue and promote. Also, Iran has been recalled by Ambassador Mussolo. I think that it is absolutely important to continue drafting a policy that as Italians, as Europeans, we do hope might also having again Europe and US working together to confront the terrible challenge posed by that regime. So I think that this conference again confirms the importance of our cooperation. Two great institutions like ISPI and Atlantic Council, two countries, United States and Italy. This is something that has been particularly important even during the year marked by COVID-19. I'm sure that our collective support, our collective energy will make sure that not just the Rome Med conference scheduled for December, late November, early December in Rome is a success, but this cooperation continues next year. So I wish everybody very fruitful cooperation. And as of now, I can tell you, arrivederci next year. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much. Let me say just a couple of sentences before passing to my colleague, Kirsten Fontenrose. Mr. Ambassador, you raised the issue of Libya. This is a great opportunity for me to salute Karim Mesran, really the heart of our connection to North Africa and Italy, as the director of our North Africa Initiative and resident senior fellow in the Rafi Hariri Center and Middle East programs. He's well respected, deeply respected, well liked by his colleagues. So salute to Karim. Libya is such a crucial issue, Mr. Ambassador. On Lebanon, this is being partnered with the Rafi Hariri Center Middle East. It's a tragedy what's going on in Lebanon. We are determined to help find our way to a better future through our Middle East programs. But thank you so much for raising those two issues. And with that, let me pass to Kirsten. She'll be kicking off the event with a fireside chat, though I always wonder in this virtual world, where's the fire? But with a dynamic duo, General Jim Jones, who I've spoken about already, and Ambassador Paula Dobryansky, she'll introduce them. Let me just say very briefly that Kirsten was a big catch for the Atlantic Council. She leads our security pillar within Middle East programs as director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. And she's had 20 years of experience working with all the countries of the Middle East and Africa within the Pentagon, the Department of State, White House, private industry, nonprofit sector. So Kirsten, let me pass to you.
Thank you so much, Fred. And I actually considered turning on a fire this morning, but it is still a bit too warm here in DC. So thanks for everyone for joining us. And with us this morning, we have two heavy hitters. Let me introduce them to you before our discussion. Ambassador Paula Dobryansky, a foreign policy expert and former diplomat specializing in national security affairs, is a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and vice chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. During her more than 25 years in national security affairs, Ambassador Dobryansky has held many Senate-confirmed senior-level positions in the US government, including serving as the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009. Among her primary accomplishments, Ambassador Dobryansky established and led the US-India, US-China, and US-Brazil Global Issues Fora. and in 2007 received the Secretary of State's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal, for her contribution to the historic devolution of power in Belfast. Also with us is General James L. Jones. As the former commander of U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Jones led all military operations for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and later, as National Security Advisor, he brought clear vision and steady leadership to America's mission in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and the country's interests around the world. He served as military assistant to the Secretary of Defense from 1997 to 1999 and became the 32nd Commandant of the United States Marine Corps in July 1999. Upon retirement in February 2007, General Jones became the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy, served as the State Department's Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security, and then served as President Obama's National Security Advisor at the White House. We have only a short time to cover lots of ground with these two world-class leaders, so let's dive right in. Ambassador Dobryansky, I'll turn to you first, if you will. In order to frame our discussion about the future of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, can you help us establish the baseline? As a former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, you are the perfect person to authoritatively assess what the major diplomatic achievements of the Trump administration's foreign policy in the Middle East have been. Can you kick us off with that analysis?
Kirsten, good morning and thank you, and good morning, General Jones. Before I answer that question, I must extend greetings and say hello to Ambassador Mussolo and also Ambassador Verrecchio, and just to say to them that we are delighted with the Atlantic Council co-sponsoring this annual event, and just very, very delighted to be here this morning. As to your question, let me mention 4 areas that I think that the administration would certainly cite as key successes. In fact, in the ambassador's opening comments, Ambassador Verrecchio, he mentioned, I think, one of the most significant and groundbreaking and historic successes of the administration, and that's the establishment of the diplomatic relations between Israel and the Gulf states of the UAE and Bahrain, known as the Abraham Accords. Clearly, this is an initiative that has significant ramifications for the region in a very positive way. The kind of economic benefits that will flow from it, I think, will be immeasurable and also significant in terms of the establishment and solidification of stability. That would be my first. The second one that I would pick out is one that was a campaign promise. President Trump had mentioned at the very beginning, 4 years ago of his term, that he would move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. There have been presidents before him, Republican and Democrat alike, who've made that promise, and then it didn't unfold. The administration sees that very much as a success and as a promise that was well kept. The third one that I would pick out would be relevant to the demise of ISIS and the Caliphate. Here, I don't need to overstate the ramifications and the importance of that. And then finally, I would say that the ambassador, in fact, had mentioned the issue of Iran. The administration's maximum pressure campaign, which was very steadfast and very consistent, as all of the participants here know, that the administration upfront said it was not going to go down the path of the JCPOA. There are differences over this issue, but the administration, and I think rightly so, views this as a success. It has been consistent in its approach in dealing with Iran. It has definitely impacted Iran. As we know, the regime has been denied more than $100 billion in oil revenue. The country is in acute recession. Inflation, according to the IMF, has soared to over some 40%. And the rial, the national currency, has also lost more than 60% of its value. And then even finally, in terms of crude oil exports, it's been cut by 80%. So I would identify those as being some of the key achievements of the administration.
Ambassador, we're watching in the final months of the administration a lot of additional effort put into things like expanding the countries involved in the Abraham Accords, and certainly no let up on the maximum pressure campaign. What do you think the region should expect from a second Trump administration if he's to be elected in terms of the relationship between Israel and the Gulf, or the US and Iran, or other aspects of the region?
I think that the Abraham Accords and the signing at the White House and the relationship, diplomatic relationship established between Israel with the UAE and Bahrain, I think the next step, and it's already in fact been stated, is to expand that and to actually engage and bring in other countries from the Gulf. I think in this regard, a focal point is Saudi Arabia. And as we know, when we look back at the beginning of the of the Trump administration, the Trump administration's first trip actually to the Middle East was in fact, as we recall, to Saudi Arabia. And I think that this is going to be front and center in terms of a future Trump administration. That is what I think that they would have in place and as a priority. You are muted.
Sometimes that might be the better option, yeah. But General Jones, let's turn to you and shift the focus a little bit to talk about some great power competition. And as a former national security advisor, you know that no matter who is sitting in the Oval Office next year, they will face challenges in setting priorities for US foreign policy in the MENA region. From a military perspective, there are calls from both parties to reduce the US military footprint in the Middle East in order to free up resources to address great power competition. Do you agree with that approach? What do you think are the enduring US interests in the Middle East?
General, you are on mute. You are muted.
It's an epidemic.
I see that.
Thank you. Kirsten, thank you very much for your question. And Ambassador Dobriansky, always a pleasure to be with you. And to our two distinguished Italian ambassadors, greetings. It's wonderful to be with you. I think that that there is a need, regardless of which administration prevails in this election, for a rebalanced American presence that bolsters both our not only military but economic and diplomatic engagement in the region in a way that is co-joined with the military engagement. I don't think military engagement alone is going to be sufficient to do much of anything in terms of long-lasting outcomes. As a matter of fact, I think in our country, there really is kind of a bipartisan fatigue about these never-ending wars in the Middle East. And I think President Trump kind of changed that conversation about American engagement in the region by attacking the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's something that the progressives in the dialogue that we witnessed today generally agree with him. So regardless of who wins, there will be less appetite for major sustained US engagement in the region from a combat perspective, but that doesn't mean that there should be a lessened US engagement in the other areas that define our whole of government approach to problem solving. But I think it's important to point out that great power competition also plays out in the Middle East and North Africa among its own member states. Russia is back in the region as a military player, despite the fact that people quickly add that it's a declining power. China is a huge economic player and will continue to be so. So the United States just can't afford to disengage from the region simply because of its major power competition with China. As a matter of fact, if we have an ambition to remain a nation of great consequence on the globe, we have to engage rather than disengage, but perhaps do it in a little bit different way than in the 20th century. The US also has ongoing interests in the region, whether it's our alliance with Israel, the region's status as an energy producer, or even the data and telecommunication links between Asia and Europe that traverse the Gulf is very important. And generally, it's my observation that the region generally prefers economic and military cooperation with the United States over any other partner. So there is a continued appetite for ongoing US military engagement and presence with the region to develop a true partnership capacity. An appetite for US military equipment and for US forces in places like the Gulf has been a long-standing measure of reassurance that the United States has a serious commitment. And lastly, I would say that the US needs more help from our allies. We need our allies in the region to translate the huge amounts they spend on defense into real capabilities. Formations of a NATO-like structure in the Gulf has been discussed. And we would welcome, I think, more European engagement in the region in a more cohesive manner to affect the changes and the relationships that we want to have for the foreseeable future.
There's a lot to dive into there, and we'll get to several of those topics, I hope, if we have time. I'll go back and start with one of the first comments you made, and we'll build up to some of the others. Touching on Russia and China, Ambassador Dobryansky, if I can turn to you. Both have been increasingly making inroads in the Middle East, and there's a perception the US is withdrawing from the region with these major powers filling in. Where do you see this dynamic going between a desire to withdraw and a need to compete with China and Russia?
If I may first give a context actually for your question, because I think I'd like to say a few more words about the great power competition, ongoing great power competition and its ramifications for the Middle East and what it is exactly. I think first I'd make the point that it's important to know that we will see for the long term this ongoing great power competition. I don't see any cessation of that. And that's not just in the Middle East, but that's globally. Both China and Russia are united in their effort in seeking to minimize, if not marginalize and diminish US power in the Middle East and elsewhere. And they're united in that purpose, and they're also united in seeking to fragment us with our allies. It's worth saying, secondly, a word about what are the Russian and Chinese goals and objectives in the region. In terms of Russia's interests itself in the Middle East, they have been very long-term and they've been strategic. We know, as for example, in the case with Syria, Russia has been very concerned about its military assets, its bases. So there's a military component and underpinning and a geostrategic underpinning. There is also, from the Russian standpoint, relative to energy, also a component, but I think it is overtaken, or it's secondary, should I say, to the first. And then I'd add a third. I think we have also witnessed the fact that Russia itself economically is in dire straits. I think that here, having its engagement internationally has offset what is happening at home. And so here looms the Middle East and its engagement in a crisis situations. As for China, China is a bit in contrast here, because I would say that China's presence in the Middle East has really been broadened and deepened over the last decade, and primarily and fundamentally in the context of commercial investment ties and also infrastructure. We have seen where China has invested particularly in port-related facilities, for example, as with other kinds of infrastructure projects. The reason why I give this as a backdrop, because I think one has to understand the balance for the United States in knowing and recognizing what is before us. General Jones well articulated how for the United States, there is a keen interest, and certainly on the part as articulated by the Trump administration, in burden sharing. That as one goes forward in dealing and grappling with the crises, and not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, and as we know with the NATO alliance, how important it is to have burden sharing. And then, very importantly, that the United States, in terms of its own investment and bringing troops home and what it puts into crises abroad, is very much moderated by that investment by others. But at the same time, as I described, there are security concerns. So in that sense, I think what the United States will continue to do is, on one hand, to look at what investments we make in terms of our own blood and treasure, to press forward with encouraging our friends, our allies, those in the region, as well as our friends and allies, for example, in Europe, in also coming and stepping forward and working on these crises. That way, I think that the United States will continue to sustain its important leadership role, but at the same time in a way that does not have the kind of drawdown that has existed on its own resources. So that balance, I think, will be maintained going forward.
So what it sounds like in terms of the engagement is that they're very divergent in terms of approach between Russia and China. I know that you recently wrote with former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley a strategic insights brief published by the Atlantic Council on the alignment between China and Russia. What are your findings on that strategic alignment? Do you see that alignment playing out in the Middle East, or do you believe their approach will remain divergent?
What we had indicated in that strategic insights memo is that, first of all, you can anticipate and expect that Russia and China will be aligned for the long term in terms of their broad strategic goals. And they're united by the goal I mentioned earlier, and that is specifically the diminishment, marginalization of US power abroad. And in this case, specifically in the Middle East, because this is our topic of and our focal point. But secondly, what also unites them is also the fragmentation of our relations with our allies, with our friends. And we've witnessed that playing out, and not just only in the Middle East, but in other regions. So the first point is we're in for the long term in that regard, and the United States must be vigilant and must actually think of the most effective strategies of going forward in not just competing, but also being and going on the offensive in this case, and it has. Secondly, I would say what we also emphasized in the memo is that although they are aligned, that doesn't preclude that there will be tensions between Russia and China along the way. As we know historically, both have had moments, breaks, and also they haven't always agreed on a specific path. And I did articulate and take the time to indicate what are some of the differences of their own approach in the Middle East. And certainly in the case of Russia, it definitely is more dominated by military considerations and its military assets in contrast to China in this case. Having said that, that brings me to the third and the last point. What we also emphasize is that for US policymakers, it's absolutely essential to be very apprised of this alignment. We don't see it, and we didn't define it as some have termed it as a marriage of convenience. We don't see it. That's rather short term. On the other hand, we didn't go so far to say that it is an alliance. Although, by the way, I believe that Putin, when describing it, had described it as an alliance. But we look at what the actions are. And as I indicated, there have been some differences and there have been some tensions. So what we have defined it as is an alignment, and policymakers have to take that into account in their various policy positions going forward.
Thank you. General Jones, in addition to great powers and sometimes in cahoots with them, there's another actor on the border of the region that it has an outsized impact on events within the region, and to Ambassador Dobryansky's point, is often the source of tensions between America and her allies, much in the same way that Russia and China can be. And this is Turkey. One challenge for the next administration will be re-engaging productively with Turkey. Turkey is a major US partner in the Middle East, as well as a NATO ally, but there is divergence at times between Washington and Ankara over issues like Turkey's involvement in Syria and Libya and its relationships with Russia and Iran. How should the US approach, revamp its engagement with Turkey? You know, how should we be looking at a new administration taking a new look at how we handle that relationship?
Thank you, Kirsten. Just to follow on with Ambassador Dobryansky's very, very good comment, I think that regardless of whether it's a Biden or Trump administration, there needs to be a restatement of intent on the part of the United States and commitment. And once that is done, and it should be backed up by tangible evidence that we are serious about what we say we're going to do and what we mean when we talk about engagement with our allies, that it's not a flavor of the month type of engagement. It's actually real commitment. And I think that's been missing for the last couple of administrations. I think the Trump administration has actually done a little bit better in that regard. But as to the Turkish question, as the former chairman of the American-Turkish Council and as a former NATO official dealing with Turkey, let me say that there are no easy answers to that particular issue. The S-400 question and the President Erdogan's assertive behavior in the region are difficult questions politically. Turkey is going to remain a complicated partner, but it's important to think of them as a long-term ally and to maintain that relationship, and not just from a military perspective, but also from an economic perspective as well. We should focus in the relationship as we have been doing. As you know, both presidents have set a goal of $100 billion in trade between both Turkey and the United States. That's very ambitious. We're nowhere near that right now, but at least there is a marker out there for us to try to achieve. This is a possible bright spot for U.S. engagement. The United States has become a major exporter of LNG for Turkey, for example. That's also a good story. We can broaden our engagement. The political leadership of Turkey is not all of Turkey. The U.S. should focus on campaigns to engage, I think, Turkish civil society. And I think the Turkish government could do an awful lot to convince the public in Turkey that we are not the enemies that they think we are. The public opinion polling of the U.S. in Turkey has been consistently terrible, almost for the last 20 years. So, but this is something that both countries have talked about, but we have not really completely and successfully addressed it. I think for its part, Turkey has to engage more thoughtfully with the United States, particularly with Congress here in Washington, and we've had those discussions with Turkish officials, so that's not new to them. Improving the relationships will require a lot of personal engagement and interpersonal contacts that have sometimes been hard to establish, and we should compartmentalize conflict and cooperation. This is not the Turkey of the 1990s. We'll work together on some issues. We'll challenge each other at times, but we have to get used to that reality. And hopefully in time, the political divergence that we witnessed in the last several years will also find its own path towards a more common and more traditional relationship. It is an extremely important relationship, and we need to focus on that for the future, not only for the bilateral aspect of it, but also for the behavior and capability of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As you know, Turkey has a very, very impressive military capability, and it's one that we need to have in consonance and harmony with NATO itself.
Thank you. Ambassador Dobryansky, General Jones touched on LNG briefly, and just last month, the new East Mediterranean Energy Forum was launched. This forum will promote natural gas exports from the Eastern Med. It includes Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy, but notably does not include Turkey. What are the prospects for the forum, and what are its implications for the Middle East outside of these nations?
Thank you, Kirsten. Before I answer that, I did want to make just one comment because General Jones said something I think very important that I'd like to underscore, and that is about the commitment to the region. And that was part of your last question. And I wanted to say and point out that for the United States, and particularly looking at the Abraham Accords, how it really has underscored, I think, an engagement that is a very sustainable and significant engagement in terms of our relationship with Israel. Because I look back in the past period, not during the last 4 years, but before, there were tensions in the relationship between the US and Israel. I think that has really been solidified. And also looking at the Gulf states and the other countries in the Middle East. And I think it was an important point he mentioned, and I also want to just say that how crucial the region is, and I think that particularly that recent signing, not only is it groundbreaking and historic, but it underscores a commitment and our engagement in that process. Let me go to your question. It's exciting. And I was glad to hear Ambassador Verrecchio address this in his opening comments about the East Mediterranean Energy Forum. You have 6 countries, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy, and then also the Palestinian Authority that are part of this. It has so much prospect for this area, not just only obviously in the context of energy and energy resources and how crucial that is in this case, but also the economic benefits that will also flow therefrom. And also the political benefits, I think, for the region that will flow therefrom. As I understand it, also that France, the United States, and the EU, there's discussion about observer status relevant to this forum. So that too is, I think, a very important component and development. I think that this will also enable Israel to be able to strengthen ties with its Arab neighbors in a very constructive and very practical and concrete way that's beneficial to all. And I think it will also, it has another dimension, and that is being able to promote cooperation not only from the Arab countries, but also with the European countries. In a way, this is truly a kind of first of its kind arrangement where countries are, exporting gas to Jordan and Egypt with a kind of $30 billion value. So it's groundbreaking, it's exciting, and it was long in coming. And I think that it's going to provide, as I said, a kind of political cohesiveness, certainly for the Middle East, that I think is important in this case.
I almost want to end there just because it's so nice to hear good news about the region. But we'll go on and perhaps on a bit more somber topic. Ambassador, if I can stay with you for the moment. Threats from Iran. They've been a major focus for the Middle East for several administrations, both in terms of the nuclear threat and Iran's foreign policy of supporting proxies and supplying weapons across the region. What do you think will be the biggest priorities for the next administration when it comes to Iran?
Well, I think the priorities remain and they've been front and center, and they remain, and that is first and foremost preventing Iran from securing nuclear weapon capability. That's of concern to all of us. Also, secondly, is a concern that's not just shared by us, but it is by all of our friends, allies, and those in the Middle East, and that is stemming Iran's active support for its terrorist proxies who have wreaked havoc in so many countries. Ambassador Verrecchio had mentioned in his opening comments, he had made a comment about the concerns about Lebanon. The support that Iran has given to Hezbollah really just is tragic. That's a country that can thrive, and regrettably and tragically, where it is, it doesn't have to be there. So the second is stemming Iran's active support for terrorist proxies, and then the third is the development of ballistic missile capability. I think those are the three very front and center issues that are on the table and remain of concern.
Thank you. And both presidential campaigns have spoken positively about their desire to engage in diplomatic talks with Iran if elected. Do you think there's the possibility, regardless of who's in the office, of a major diplomatic breakthrough with Iran, either between the US and Iran or between Gulf states and Iran?
In my view, I know that there will be, in this case, a steadfast support of having maximum pressure on Iran. Whether it diplomatically comes to the table, I can't speculate on that. But what I will say is that the fact is it's been given opportunities to come to the table and to engage, and it hasn't. And I think in that context, the maximum pressure campaign is such that it has to be sustained because in terms of the course of action that Iran has pursued, it not only impacts, of course, our friends and allies, those in the Middle East, it impacts our European allies, friends, it impacts our national security interests. So I would just simply say, as to whether there's a diplomatic option in either direction, they've been given ample opportunities to come forward and to engage. And as we know, for example, with the Trump administration, they have put forward very specific points to engage on, have offered to have dialogue. And, I think that the responsibility rests on the Iranians for not coming forward, which is unacceptable.
Kirsten, I agree with that entirely. I think that within the next 3 to 5 years, could be longer or shorter, I think the regime in Iran is likely to collapse from within. And that would be a very good thing. I don't think Iran has shown any desire to join the family of kind of civilized nations. And I think the Iranian leadership should be excluded from some of the international organizations that they participate in. They are not going to change, I don't believe. And their record on human rights is atrocious. And I think the leadership ought to be more, in many dictatorships that violate human rights, ought to be more systematically isolated from the global community until there is change generally from within. But I think the pressure that we are putting on Iran is going to accelerate the possibility of a change in the regime. And I think it will come from the people of Iran, who deserve a lot better than they're getting.
And Kirsten, if I may just jump in on that last point on General Jones, if I can, he mentioned the people. And what's also striking The Iranian people have gone to the streets, they have spoken, and they've spoken also about the rampant corruption that exists within the regime. And I think that not only the maximum pressure campaign has, as I articulated earlier, is having a very directive effect. You could see the results. But I also think it's been significant, the voice of the Iranian people and the fact that they have exposed the rampant corruption. It will crumble from within.
Thank you. Important thoughts there for our European partners to hear. I'm going to bring it back to the home hearth now, General Jones, with a question for you that's really narrowing the scope to kind of US thoughts. A difficult puzzle for the Department of Defense in a next administration will be covering down on all of the competing priorities in the National Defense Strategy, many of which we've discussed here. Now that COVID response has required shuffling resources and amending deployment and exercise plans, but has not resulted in a decrease in any of the threats identified in the NSS or the NDS that we've talked about today. Do you believe restructuring beyond moving budgets and manpower slots will be required in order to do this? And if so, what do you envision being necessary?
Well, I love this question because it's something I've thought about for many, many years. First, I think this is an opportunity to talk about reforming U.S. engagement in general. I'm of the opinion that we should restructure what we call our combatant commands, which is a name I don't like. I'd rather refer them as unified commands. The United States has been fortunate since just about the end of World War II with the NATO alliance, but also with the privilege of having military commands geographically located in different countries and on different continents. This is a privilege that we should treasure, even as it continues on today. Of late, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years maybe, there's been a tendency to try to bring some of those commands back to the United States. I think of the U.S. Southern Command, for example, which is now in Florida, the United States Central Command, which is also in Florida. Fortunately, the European Command and the Pacific Command are still located in the regions that they hope to be able to work in. We created a new unified command called AFRICOM. I believe it should be in Africa, and I think there are ways that we might be able to do that, but it is in Stuttgart, Germany, as you know. But I also think that it's time to make these commands a little bit more representative of the whole of government approach to our international relations. I believe that we should have a very senior ambassador assigned to each geographic organization. I think we should have senior representation from the interagency, particularly commerce, energy, and the like. And I think a forward presence that is representative of, if you will, the whole of government approach would enable us to have ongoing discussions with our friends and allies in the regions that we are concerned with, and would make it less difficult by working in the same time zones with our friends and allies with senior representation to have more of an operationalized engagement strategy. The Atlantic Council has published a document on this, a study that we did some years ago, and it would be good to dust that one off, I think, and present it to whichever administration comes into being as an option to change the focus from a purely military engagement to one that is more representative of the entire government. So second, I think, as I mentioned before, I think the United States needs more from our friends and allies. The opportunity to focus Europe and NATO on playing a greater role in defending Europe and crisis management in its near abroad, to free up the US for the competitive struggle that we're going to have and are having with China. And we need to develop this concept. I think it would be a good idea to develop the concept of a Arab type of NATO to sharpen the regional deterrence against Iran. So there are a lot of things I think that can be done in different regions. I don't think the United States should try to do it alone. I think we should cultivate the great relations that we have, and we should pay more attention to our allies and have more presence located in the geographical areas that are more representative of the entirety of our government.
Thank you so much, General Jones. I have one final question for both of you, kind of very big picture. What do you think are some of the biggest unaddressed challenges for the US in the Middle East on any level? You can take this anywhere you'd like. And we have, you know, a good couple of minutes for you to address this. So don't be shy. Let's see if we can really get a nice list going here for the next administration. Ambassador Dobryansky, can we start with you?
Okay, I was going to let General Jones go first on that one, but here goes. I think, first of all, you know, you use the term, you know, unaddressed. In this case, I think that it's important to have a sustainment of what's been put in place. So I'll start with that, actually, because I don't think we can overlook that. And we've discussed that. We've discussed about the extension of the Abraham Accords and what the context would mean. We've discussed also the importance of a sustainment of approach vis-a-vis Iran, and given the challenges before us. I would also, and we also discussed the fact of the rise of the East Mediterranean Energy Forum, which is exciting. I would put also, I think, into this mix, we had a reference, at least I know in the opening, the ambassador referenced Lebanon. I wanted to pick out Lebanon because of the recent tragedy that unfolded and how crucial, you know, how that impactful that has been on Lebanon. You have a population that is so talented and has so much to offer. I was very struck by actually the outpouring of support from the United States for the Lebanese people. Many members of the Lebanese community have jumped in and the Lebanese American community have jumped in and been helpful. So I think here a focus on Lebanon, where it's been, where it's going forward. I'd also pick out the development issue. The United States, along with many other countries, has always been focused on economic issues and development issues throughout the Middle East, the importance. That's where I'm excited about the Abraham Accords, because that in of itself will spawn such kind of economic dynamic from within. And then I guess I'd also just add in the mix, there always has been the challenge of refugees. I know for myself, during my tenure in government, I dealt with the refugee issues. And that's been an issue that has flowed out of many of the crises of the Middle East. And I would say it's a humanitarian issue, one that we all have a stake in and have all contributed to. So those are a few that I would put on the list.
Beautiful list. General Jones, thoughts from you?
Thank you. My answer would be maybe not so much on unaddressed issues, but unresolved issues as well. On unaddressed issues, I think North Africa is extraordinarily important. What's going on in Libya is very, very important, as our ambassadors, our Italian ambassadors pointed out. Completely agree with Lebanon. Syria is unresolved. And I don't think there is a military solution there. So we're going to continue to have to work on that one. Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and the refugee problem that Ambassador Dobryansky mentioned is absolutely valid. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the nations in Africa that are struggling, still struggling between a democratic ideal and dictatorships. Human rights, of course, comes into it. We need more engagement, I think, with our friends and allies in that particular region to help make sure that the progress that was being made is not wasted. And that, to me, calls for more long-term engagement, really in-depth engagement with our friends and allies. And I think the one that is really unaddressed is the importance of the cyber threat coming from principally China, but not only China. It is extremely important, I think, that the United States and our friends and allies, particularly in Europe, who have advanced technologies, bring these technologies forward to create a new environment in the cyber world where where sovereign nations can, in fact, be sure of their security, their impenetrability, and their ability to protect their national interests, whether it be private sector interests, whether it be obviously sovereign secrets and the like. But China has really stolen the march on the West, so to speak, with their penetration in many countries, of which they make very, very, very selectively economic deals that allow China to penetrate different countries, then expand that penetration, and then ultimately, by virtue of their economic dependence on China, they are able to manipulate their political and diplomatic relations with people like with us, with other European countries. So, to me, the biggest unaddressed threat, in addition to everything that we discussed, but I think the cybersecurity threat is one that really has almost is almost co-equal with the nuclear threat that we saw develop in the 20th century. And one of the reasons that this is going to remain this way is because unless and until we develop a regulatory framework for cybersecurity that has international agreements, we're going to continue to be at the mercy of countries that have no scruples about penetrating other countries, stealing their secrets, and doing all kinds of nefarious things. So those would be that would be my list, Kirsten.
Kirsten, I'm going to jump in again to two-finger. I like very much what the general said there about cyber. My only slight add-on would be, I think that it has begun, that discussion, actually in the region on cyber, which is a really good thing. Actually, a number of the Gulf countries, along with the United States and with a number of European allies. And so the only thing I would just modify, I think, I don't know if I'd use the word unaddressed. I think it has begun, but again, back to the point, as you said, and I'm saying, things need to be sustained. But you're right in terms of the scale and the scope. It has to be focused on. It's a priority.
The question that, if I could just add on to that, the question that that I hear most often in different countries on cybersecurity is, okay, we accept what you say about the Chinese technology and the risk that that poses if we adopt this technology. But what's your answer, U.S.? What is it? What's your solution? And I think in the United States, we need to answer that question with better organization, better interagency cooperation, and, if you will, kind of a John F. Kennedy moonshot type of organization where public and private sector interests come together to develop the technology, which is out there, by the way, that will provide our friends and allies and organizations like NATO a secure, impenetrable capability that is applicable to legacy systems as well. And so this will be an exciting time. I think Ambassador Dobryansky's absolutely right. The dialogue has started, but I think the United States government needs to play a more persuasive role in terms of what the alternatives are.
Thank you so much. This discussion has been ripe with recommendations and lots to think about. As we close, I'd like to give each of you a chance to make any final comments to our European partners. We're partnering with Italy on this endeavor, and certainly we have quite a bit of European viewership here. So any final thoughts for them as we close today? Ambassador Dobryansky, to you first.
Absolutely. We have a close relationship, a long-standing relationship with Italy. It also, in terms of Italy's support and collaboration with us in military bases and assets, thank you. We have been close in that regard. And let me just say, we're delighted that the Atlantic Council could partner with IPSI. We're appreciative of that, and we want to go forward. This is an important topic, and this discussion is of great value and must be sustained.
I completely agree with Ambassador Dobryansky. If my wife were on this program, she would want to tell you that the furniture that she bought in Sorrento is absolutely all over the house. And Italian furniture is her favorite, and we're happy to contribute to the economy whenever we can.
Thank you so much to Ambassador Paolo Dobryansky and to General Jim Jones for your thoughts, your experience, your wisdom, and your recommendations here, and your positive thoughts about U.S. and transatlantic engagement in the next administration and in the future writ large. Really appreciate your joining us, and I will pass the microphone now back to our hosts at ISPI. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was having some problems with the internet connection. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for the previous panel. Really excellent. I'm very excited and privileged to be the moderator today of a great panel that will be extremely interesting and important, not only for the contest, but also for the experience of the persons involved into this. Why I thank you very much for their presence and for their help. Since we are getting short of time, I'll go directly to the panel, and I will briefly introduce each one of the experts that are coming, and then we go directly to the questions. We have Rosa Balfour, Dr. Rosa Balfour, who is the director of Carnegie Europe, and one of the foremost, if not the foremost, expert on European politics, European institutions, foreign policy, and security. Prior to joining Carnegie, she was a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a director of the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center in Brussels, and worked as a researcher in Italy and London. And that's when, long time ago, when we first met, Rosa, when you were beginning to work in Rome, long time ago. Jeffrey Feldman is a visiting fellow in international diplomacy at the Brookings Institution and a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation, where he examined the United Nations and other mediation efforts to draw lessons about potential improvements on multilateral conflict prevention and resolution, which is exactly what we need in these people, in this moment in North Africa. Prior to Brookings, Ambassador Feldman was a U.S. Foreign Service officer for nearly 26 years. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2009 until he retired from the State Department and went to the United Nations as Under Secretary General for Political Affairs in New York. Giovanna Kaddour is a non-resident senior fellow with Rafik Hariri Center Middle East programs. She leads the Syria portfolio for us. Giovanna is currently a member of the UN Facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee, which is part of the Civil Society Group. She's the co-founder of Syria Relief and Development and serves as vice chairwoman of the American Relief Coalition for Syria. I think we can begin if you're all okay with it. Ambassador Feldman, the MENA region is undoubtedly undergoing a very important historical moment. Somebody defines a defining moment. I would say a transformational one. Can you share your opinion with us of what, according to you, from your privileged position, you and experience, what is going on really on the ground, and what is really in the power, you think, of a U.S. administration with a new or the same as that happened? They can really do. What is according to the role or lack of role that has to change or has to be implemented by the U.S. administration?
Well, Kareem, thank you very much for the question, and let me start off by just expressing my appreciation to ISBE and to the Atlantic Council for including me in this. The discussion so far this morning, the opening remarks, the fireside chat just now have been fascinating and very rich. So thank you very much for the privilege of being part of this today. Kareem, to your question about about what's happening in the region, I agree that this transformational change is happening in the region, but I would say there are actually 3 transformational changes happening simultaneously. The first is one that the previous speakers have spent a lot of time on, and which is the relationship between some of the Gulf states, notably UAE and Bahrain, and Israel, that might be expanded to others. Now, in a way, this is existing relationships coming out of the closet. You know, I think we know that there have been long-standing contacts between Bahrain and Israel and the UAE and Israel, but the fact that they are now public, the fact that this is now something that can be acknowledged and built on and expanded upon is a transformational change. And it indicates, as other speakers have said, that the leaders of these countries, UAE and Bahrain, and I think others will come along, are prioritizing their concern with Iran over any concern they might have about public opinion, which is still largely sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And I'll come back to this transformational change in a minute with some additional thoughts. But the second transformational change I see in the region, of the 3 that I would identify, is that sort of U.S. yearning to reduce or change its footprint in the Middle East. The U.S., the sort of instinct that Americans from both parties across the political spectrum have, that yes, we have interest in the Middle East, but that perhaps our footprint, particularly our military footprint, needs to be adjusted in light of other priorities. And this is already, I think, having an impact on leaders in the region in realizing that they need to not rely solely, exclusively on the United States, but also to broaden their contacts with Europeans and others. And then the third transformational change is one that has to do with sort of Arab public opinion. And that is, I think there's a conviction among the Arab street, to the extent that one can generalize, that popular protests need to remain peaceful, that the way that the 2011 uprisings often evolved into violence hasn't worked. And so when you look at the protests in Lebanon, you look at the protests in Iraq, you look at the protests in Algeria, you see a commitment to keeping those protests, which now are affected by coronavirus concerns, but to keep those protests peaceful. I think these are 3 transformational changes in the region. And let me expand a bit on that first one. The coming out of the closet, as I said, of existing relationships and making them public. The other speakers have said a lot about the potential benefits to these, and I concur. And I think there's a real benefit for the United States to be able to work publicly with a larger group of states in the same room on issues of shared concerns. That's possible because of the what's called the Abraham Accords. But I think that there's an impact, potential impact on the Israeli-Palestinian issues that hasn't gotten much discussion, and that is, think about the fact that the Israeli public moved so far to the right during the Second Palestinian Intifada because of the security concerns, legitimate security concerns the Israeli public had. And that has made an Israeli-Palestinian agreement more difficult. if there's a warm peace between Bahrain and Israel and the UAE and Israel, the way that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Israelis say that they want, will that make the Israelis again think a bit more creatively about their nearer neighbors, about are there ways that they can be more flexible and creative on the Israeli-Palestinian issues? My final point on this is that I am concerned as an American that there is one potential long-term downside to us of the Abraham Accords. And it's probably outweighed by all the positive aspects of it, but that is, will these countries work together at some point against our interests? If an administration has a certain policy that the Israelis and Emiratis decide they don't like, are they going to be able to work more publicly in affecting US public opinion, US congressional support than they could before? So that's one question mark I have about them.
Excellent. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Can pass to Rosa, Dr. Balfour. I would like to go directly to the big elephant in the room, Turkey. It is How will the EU relationship with Turkey impact the future of the transatlantic relationship?
Very much.
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, no, I heard it. It's okay, about Turkey and Europe and the US. It's, I mean, indeed, Europe has been increasingly humbled by Turkey's adventurism in the Mediterranean, first in Libya and now in the East Mediterranean, hitting directly the sovereignty of one of the EU member states. And so far the EU has been really quite unable to respond. And this obviously has an effect because Turkey being a member of NATO, and NATO also not being able to resolve, we all know that NATO was not designed to address confrontations among its members. It was designed for deterrence and territorial defense. So there will be this will come to the fore. And I think what is happening now with respect to the transatlantic relationship is just an example of how the modus operandi between the EU and the US with respect to Turkey has broken down completely. The EU had focused its relationship with Turkey on economics and on offering a prospect of accession. Now that prospect of accession is long gone. It has been a gradual process, but the EU has been very slow in trying to develop a strategic partnership, leaving the strategic security military aspects more in the hands of the US. And that kind of division of labor clearly is not functioning anymore. So should there be a change of administration in the US, I think that could open up the space for a different type of conversation between Europeans and Americans on how to rein in Turkey and what kind of mix of incentives to do that. Europe has already offered an incentive, that's an upgraded customs union, and Erdogan turned it down. And this was something that Turkey had been wanting. Europe's positioning, Europe's ability to develop a more strategic relationship with Turkey has been basically handcuffed by the fear, the threat, Turkey's threat of sending refugees from Syria and Afghanistan, which are currently on Turkish territory, sending them to Europe, because we know that in 2015, 2016, Europe went through a major political crisis because of the arrival of 1 million refugees from conflict zones. And this has seriously limited Europe's ability to design any strategy that is capable of reining in Erdogan's adventurism at the moment. So I think it would actually take a change of administration in the US, and that ought to trigger a different kind of conversation between Americans and Europeans on how to deal with Turkey's new disruptive role in the region, which applies not just to the immediate region, but also beyond that. I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Armenia, Azerbaijan at the moment, but also in Libya. So, so the room for maneuver for Europe alone has been has shown to be quite limited on all of these conflict zones. It's been a period in which, be it because of US changes of policy, be it because of a longer term progressive disengagement, it has allowed other actors to come in, and Europe has simply not been able to substitute, to take on some of the roles that the US took on before. So there is a dire need from a European perspective to have a different kind of engagement with the US to talk about the Middle East and North Africa.
Sure, yeah, that's a very good point. Giovanna, from your point of view, how do you see this moment in the region? Is it as pivotal as it is perceived here, or you see other action, other factor coming in? And do you see the US as playing an essential part in the turmoil, either by being there too much or not being there at all?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Karim, for having us, and thank you to my co-panelists for your thoughtful comments. I mean, you know, Karim, prior to this, you asked me to speak a little bit about this question from the regional perspective. So I'll answer your question with that in mind. I think 10 years ago, the euphoria around the Arab Spring, there was a very different moment. I think whether or not that euphoria was well-founded, I mean, I think, you know, how things have played out have not necessarily ended up in any way the way that the people of the region initially anticipated. But there was a lot of momentum around a series of Arab Springs that aimed at minimum, you know, to provide reforms, at times completely toppling the existing regimes. But I think what we've seen is 10 years later, we realize that while the Arab world may know what it does not want, it's not clear that it actually knows what it does want. I think on the issues of, you know, destroying or you know, toppling what currently exists, we've seen some of that happen, and we've certainly seen that happen to some extent in Syria, to some extent in Tunisia, to some, you know, to much, you know, in Yemen, you could probably argue that occurred to some extent. But I think in terms of the population itself coming together and coming together on a consensus about what they do want moving forward, I think that's still very much absent. The divisions that existed, I think, in regimes prior to 2011, they're no longer in the back burner. There are very real religious differences. There's sectarianism at play. There's classism, educational discrepancies, the role of religion in the state. These are very divisive issues, and they, you know, they're present in every country. And there's, like I said, no agreement among society itself in any one of these countries on how to resolve these issues, how to, you know, while there are, you know, I think some pockets of you know, liberal, secular, you know, populations dispersed in these countries, I think they still remain, you know, very much a minority. And I think the idea of developing a state based on citizenship is still a far, you know, we still have a far way to go before, I think, reaching that kind of moment. I don't want to repeat what my, you know, colleagues have said, is particularly Ambassador Feltman, about, you know, the role of the United States. We all know that the United States wants to play less of a role in this region. Both parties, this is across the board, especially in these conflicts that have extended for, you know, that are now stagnant, and they've been ongoing for, like I said, at least a decade. But at the same time, there has been, you know, the United States, in taking a step back, has conceded a lot of territory to other actors like China, Russia, and Iran. And the United States is not prepared to confront these actors head on in the region. It's not, you know, it's not willing to go to war to confront these actors in the region. And so part of this has come down to, you know, what role can the US play that doesn't put it directly in harm's way? You know, and that's why I think it's important that we're seeing regional security agreements come come about. I think that, the UAE-Israel deal and among the, the other, we're hearing about Sudan and others, and I think that's going to be vital for the region taking ownership for its own, security concerns. But I think there's going to be more and more with time, more onus on the region to take responsibility for not just its own security, but also sorting out some of the very real issues that its societies are dealing with. This is not something the United States can do for it. And, while there are nefarious actors who want to meddle with that, I think if the people of the region want to transform this moment from stagnant conflicts into lasting, stable, hopefully democracies, a big part of that responsibility really lies on the people themselves.
Excellent. And this raises many other questions all around the dynamics of this reappropriation of their own destiny and their own future of the populations on the ground and the interaction of other external players. Thank you, John. Ambassador Feldman, this is a question that I really have at heart. You have top positions in US diplomacy, but also in the international organizations such as the US. Can you discuss the role of international organizations in this new, much more fragmented world, and the MENA region in particular, of course? Because I have the impression that all these international organizations, seeing the facts, especially in the context of Libya, has proven incredible limits and incredible limitations. Up to the point that about a year ago, a colleague of mine was telling me, but don't you think that 20 or 30 years from now, the historians will look back at 2019, the attack of Haftar against Tripoli and the demise of the United Nations prestige, and it would be considered the moment in which the United Nations really died, were over, because they were not capable of having the Security Council behind the Secretary General and so on. So this is a question that I would really like to hear your opinion, please.
Thanks again, Kareem, for the question, and I very much appreciate the comments that the other panelists made before this question. And in fact, let me just note, I found it unusual that in the fireside chat with Jim Jones and Paulo Dobriansky, that these questions of conflicts didn't come up until the very end. Paulo Dobriansky made a hint of these conflicts when she talked about refugees in some of her closing remarks. Jim Jones said about it more directly. But for the half hour, 45 minutes that we spent listening to them, they weren't talking about the very real peace and security conflicts that are ongoing in the Middle East and North Africa, which I found to be fascinating. But now the multilateral system. The obituary of the UN at 75 has been written many times. Everyone recognizes that there's a crisis in multilateralism, including the lack of an effective international response to the crisis in Yemen and Syria and in Libya. The crisis is real without question. But I also think that many of us who have been writing about the crisis in multilateralism, who've been writing about the UN being on life support at best, we're accustomed to a different UN. We were accustomed to a UN in a post-Cold War period. We got used to the fact that after 1989, that we had for a brief moment a unipolar world for 10, 15 years, where the US was basically had the ability to set the agenda, and where the US could use the United Nations and other multilateral institutions as a force multiplier for US policy objectives, and often contributed to global good. But we're no longer in that world. We're now back in a world that's more analogous with the Cold War, where the UN was frequently paralyzed, and where the Soviet Union and the United States would alternatively compete and cooperate in the United Nations, depending on what the issue was. Even in the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States joined forces to help defeat smallpox, joined forces to strengthen the IAEA, even while you had Khrushchev, pounding his shoe on the table. And I think that's what we have to look at today, is we're going to have to look at the UN as a place for competition and opportunities for cooperation that we would try to find, not as the type of UN that many of us got used to after '89. Now, the UN wasn't perfect after '89 either. We think of Rwanda, Srebrenica. There are horrible examples of UN failures, but it was sort of the golden age of peacemaking. You had peace agreements, UN facilitated in Central America, Namibia, other places in Africa, East Timor, Nepal, etc. That's not the world we live in today. Moreover, it's not a bipolar world the way that the world was in the Cold War, because countries like Turkey, as has been discussed this morning, are no longer as willing to follow, to be deferential to, say, a US lead, I'm sorry, that happened during the Cold War. So you've got regional powers no longer willing to be deferential to their former great powers, and you've got China-US competition. But the other thing is, and this is more, I'm getting to the region, Karim. I apologize for the long answer.
Take your time.
I think that the post-World War II era, including during the Cold War, is a model for how we should look at the world today. Think about what happened after World War II and the decades after World War II. It wasn't that the UN was expected to do everything. No, there was a multi-layered approach to multilateralism. You had NATO that was based on North Atlantic security. You had eventually the OSCE growing out of the Helsinki process, where you could have discussions about sensitive issues across those Cold War lines. The EU, of course, developed over a series of years. And of course, you had the international financial institutions, et cetera. So you had layers of institutions, each of which had a specific purpose, a specific governing body, but the overlapping nature was complementary. The region lacks this. North America, Europe, they may be under strain now, but the sort of layers of multilateralism with different institutions providing different channels of communication, different ways of de-escalating trade conflicts or military conflicts, those still exist. The region doesn't really have them. The Arab League is not comparable to institutions you see that I've just described. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation brings together a wide group of membership, but it's not the same. So to the extent that you could have a layered approach in the region of different types of institutions, different types of organizations with different goals, you could have increased security cooperation of like-minded states the way that Jemana was just describing. And you could also have a different organization that started to work on deconfliction across the Gulf. The conversations between the Gulf Arabs and the Iranians on a number of issues, in the same way that the Helsinki process and OSCE did for during the Cold War and the immediate period thereafter. So I really think that the region should be looking at a multi-layered approach of different organizations for different purposes with different memberships, and have a comprehensive approach to peace and security development in the region.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Rosa Barfoot, when it comes to the Middle East, US policy towards the region has harmed the EU interests, from leaving the Iranian nuclear deal to refusing to play a mediation role in the conflict in the region, to the abandonment of the two-state solution for the Middle East peace process. How do you see the situation evolving after the US elections? Do you think that a different presidency, a Biden presidency, could reverse this trend? And is the EU prepared to manage change in its neighborhood alone without the United States fully engaged?
Well, I can easily answer your last question about whether the EU is prepared to manage North Africa and the Middle East alone. That's a no. On some issues, the EU is, if there is a Biden win, the EU is expecting for sure a re-engagement with Iran, with respect to Iran and the JCPOA. But on all the other matters, I think perhaps, given that even in the case of a Biden win, the trend of the US changing its influence and role in the region predates the Trump administration. We saw that already with the Obama administration. In a sense, the way in which the Trump administration shifted the cards on the table it's essentially it's hard for Europeans, admittedly, it's a challenge for Europeans, but perhaps it will prompt them to think a little bit harder about what the real interests are of the EU in the region. And I've talked about the evident limits of European states to act to counter geopolitical actors in the region, but of course there are also other tools and strengths that the EU can play out. And I think if European states, however divided, and we know there's a long history of division in the relationship between the two shores of the Mediterranean due to history, colonial reasons, presence of diaspora communities in the different countries, different commercial interests, etc. So it's actually existentially quite difficult for European states to do that. But if they were to think a bit harder about what their interests are, they might find that certain consolidated positions reflected perhaps old positions and old commitments and old interests that are not necessarily reflected in the present times. And I'm thinking in particular of Israel, Palestine, and Ambassador Feldman was mentioning this shift has happened despite the fact that public opinion isn't really in favor of that, well, in Europe even more so, but ultimately European states haven't managed to design a policy or a form of leverage that would have an impact on the Middle East peace process, and therefore what has been happening in the region and the changes that have been introduced may force Europeans to just accept a different status quo, and therefore lead them to thinking differently about what their actual interests are. Of course, there will continue to be very specific interests. We know that Italy and France, with respect to Libya, are quite divided. They have some pretty specific interests. Karim, you know these well. Spain and Morocco, France and Tunisia. There is a whole patchwork out there. But Europeans haven't really made that effort to upgrade a common understanding of what those are. At the moment, they've been very stuck, and I would say for the past few years, of looking at the MENA region as countries of origin of terrorism, migrants, refugees, and transit countries again of migrants. And they need to think differently about how they can engage. But I do think there are actually opportunities to do that, and in a way, the way in which the tables were turned by the Trump administration might push Europeans to think a little bit more laterally about what type of engagement they can have in the region, in terms of economics, in terms of engaging with civil society, what Jemana was saying. And the EU actually has a history of doing this, and in some cases, even if the results have been disappointing compared to the hopes of the Arab Spring, but the EU has been engaging at the societal level, working with the communities that come from North Africa and the Middle East, living in Europe, be they second generation or more recent. And finally, looking at North Africa, and this is happening, North Africa as the northern part of the African continent, and not just in terms of the Mediterranean region. So these shifts are happening slowly, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about which actual policies can provide these types of opportunities. So yes, the US has damaged European interests, and most importantly, it has divided European member states with respect to their relationship with the southern shore of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But at the same time, those interests were perhaps carved in a situation that no longer exists in the region. And therefore, some kind of shaking up the context could actually be helpful to jumpstart a different thinking in European capitals about what their real interests actually are.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be a good thing. Jemana, you have to excuse me for the second question. I was visited by the ghosts of Saheddin Bidar and Michel Aflaq a few nights ago, and talking about Arab nationalism, and I thought that made this connection as that probably what we are seeing today in this demise of regimes of states fragmentation. Can we say we are seeing the end of the Arab state, in the sense the end of the Arab majority leadership, developmentalist, interventionist, collapsing in this fragmentation, and then not coming back, not having any chance to come back? What do you think about it? Do you think that there is still some basis to use Arab nationalism to rebuild some of the states, or it's completely gone? I know it's a weird question, but
no, it's fine. Thank you for the question, Karim. I mean, listen, I don't know where you fall on this, but I think the idea that there was ever a unified Arab state in any of these states has proven to be a farce. I mean, even the most repressive examples of this, you know, including the Ba'athist countries of Iraq and Syria, were not able to create a unified narrative to actually turn their people into nations. And what we're seeing today is a direct result of that. You know, the Assad regime actually will have its 50-year anniversary next month. I don't think the Syrian people are any more of a nation, you know, today than they were before the Ba'athist regime took over. And so that's why when these wars have torn through these countries, we've seen a simultaneous shredding of society. The ruptures that the population was never actually able to work through before, because these regimes pushed for these, you know, faux national identities. As I said in, you know, to the answer to my first question, is that the divisions of, you know, ethnicity, religion, class, the role of, you know, the state, they were never, you know, they're not in, you know, they're not on the back burner. They were never resolved. The tribalization of Middle Eastern societies that, you know, existed, you know, before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire are still there. I mean, the remnants are very much still there. And you look at Iraq, you look at Lebanon, you look at Syria, and the tribalism is apparent. You know, and there's suggestions to partition these states into smaller states. You know, I think that they're, you know, I think I won't, you know, this isn't the place to, you know, support or, you know, condemn such a solution. I think we've, you know, for example, you look at the KRG in Northwest Iraq, where it's, you know, Kurdish held, there's, you know, it's Kurdish dominated, but that does not mean that there aren't some, you know, deep disagreements with other minorities present in, you know, Iraq's most diverse, I think, pocket. And we saw this especially, for example, in the aftermath of ISIS, of the rise of ISIS, when, you know, the struggle on Sinjar and then the subsequent, you know, lasting tensions between the Yazidi community and the Kurdish communities in Northwest Iraq that still exists until today. And so I don't think this was created, you know, this wasn't a creation now of the Arab Spring. This is something that existed before. There is definitely lack of trust among all the stakeholders. Strong Arab regimes were not, you know, they never bothered to look at this element, this feature. Basic security keeps everyone occupied with the day-to-day, so that, you know, issues like what does citizenship mean, reconciliation between communities, these aren't, definitely not on the agenda, I think, in the immediate term. And I'm speaking generally. Of course, I understand that there's a lot of programs on the ground meant to address some of these issues on a much smaller scale, but I'm staying at the level of the state. These are not issues that are being resolved. There's widespread corruption that adds to this, serious state mismanagement of funds, of society. And so I just don't think you are going, you know, there's not going to be a savior that's going to come and sort this out in the, you know, quote unquote Arab world, as you posed. I think what we're seeing now is that the Middle East is pockets of different communities, societies, peoples, and going back to sort of the answer to my first question, while the US and the EU can play, I think, marginal role, maybe some, you know, helping hold dialogues or things like that. I mean, you know, I'm not going to diminish those kinds of efforts. I think that they might be able to play some marginal roles moving some of these discussions forward. But I think you know, the people of the Middle East accepting one another and accepting that they share this space, some of this really comes down to the people of the region resolving it among themselves. And this will take time. I think it's definitely going to take time to resolve. We're not going to see any quick solutions to this, because this has existed for a very long time. These tensions have existed for a very long time.
It's probably the failure of the national state creation that we are paying the consequences. Thank you very much, Joanne. Ambassador Feldman, last question. Given the results, I agree so far only partial, of the Arab revolts of 2011 and following, there's in the phase of the democratization process, or of adopting a pluralist vision as the main essence of the new governments, or the new governance system. Do you feel inclined to buy the UAE's, in particular, and others, narrative of the authoritarian leader as the only possible governance system for the Middle East? Do you think, more concretely, the second Trump administration or a Biden administration would change this? Would tilt America's engagement into different positions or direction? And do you believe that the US, no matter who is going to be the president, will move further away from the policy of supporting the worldwide expansion of democratization and protection of human rights for a much more parochial and partial policy? Thank you.
Kareem, I think your question is a good follow-on to the brilliant analysis that Germana just shared with us. Because I think the first thing that any administration, whether it's the Trump administration or a Biden administration, needs to keep in mind when looking at this region is modesty. You know, that these countries, these citizens, these leaders have agency, and that the United States may be able to have influence, may be able to have some impact, but the basic trajectory of the region stems from the regional dynamic, stems from the people, the leaders, the history, the politics in the region. And too often, I think that American policymakers exaggerate the role they think that the United States can play. And too often, the Arabs themselves will come to Washington or talk to American leaders and say, if only you would do this, this would happen. And so there's a narrative that comes from both sides that the U.S. is a more powerful actor in the region than in fact is the reality. And I frankly don't think it's in the U.S. interest to define the specific types of governments that these countries should have. But nor do I think it's the business of the UAE to be defining specifically what the governments should be. Nor is it the business of Russia or Turkey or anyone to define exactly what a specific form of government that's appropriate should be for other countries. But I do think that we should be asserting certain principles. And I would hope that I believe a Biden administration would reaffirm U.S. commitment to certain principles, basic respect for human rights. The idea that the governors need to govern with the consent of those governed. And this is not just principles and ideals that governments need to show respect to their populations to get respect from their populations. It's also practical. I mean, Syria, I think, is a tragic example of what happens if you try to marginalize segments of the population for far too long. I mean, so I believe that a Biden administration will come in with a commitment to restoring U.S. leadership on the promotion of human rights, on promoting certain principles, such as the governments have to have the consent of the people that they're governing. And you've already heard Joe Biden talk about the fact that he wants to assemble a summit of democracies. which I think it's a term I think it's going to be more complicated than simply saying it, defining who gets invited to some democracies. But it suggests that the intent of a Biden administration will be to move back in this direction. A Trump administration, if Trump is reelected, I think a Trump administration will continue to have a transactional approach. You know, the rubric of America first means how much of those countries are going to buy from us, and in the Middle East it means how much arms are they going to buy from us, which I think is not the basis for a constructive bilateral ties. And it's going to be the personal relationships that Trump has, the infatuation he has with authoritarian leaders. But no, I do not think that the United States should be accepting the UAE definition that only authoritarian leaders are appropriate for this region. The United States should not be defining the specific forms of government. The U.S. should be sticking to principles.
Thank you very much. Dr. Thank you, Jeff. Dr. Balfour, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Joseph Borrell, has talked about the need for the EU to speak the language of power. We see in the European Union's southern neighborhood a growing presence of actors who actually speak the language of power. How can the EU confront them? And then, what are the EU post-pandemic, given there is a post-pandemic moment, policy priorities when it comes to the MENA region, to Middle East and North Africa? And then, are there areas of cooperation in this different policy with the United States, or it's only going to be a distancing?
Thank you, Karim. No, I think on the language of power, it's aspirational, but this is not what the EU is good at doing. We're seeing, okay, some member states like France like to speak the language of power, for instance, with respect to Turkey, also with respect to Libya, but other countries such as Germany have positioned themselves to be mediators rather than to be actors. So this is really not something that the EU as a whole is good at doing, and I just don't see that it will make many inroads and be able to influence the situation in the region by using that language. Conversely, I think there are other things that Europeans can do with a much more humble ambitions that could be of interest to the societies in North Africa and the Middle East. I'd like to, first, you mentioned the pandemic. Of course, now we're in a second wave, and we don't know what the response will look like, but we know what the response to the first wave was, and Borrell, the High Representative, managed to convince European governments and European institutions not forget the neighbours in the post-pandemic, and actually fighting COVID-19 and in the post-pandemic recovery. And I think this is quite a significant positioning that Europe has chosen to invest on international institutions with respect to health policy, and to provide not just humanitarian support, but also medical support, infrastructure support for countries in North Africa and the Middle East to fight the coronavirus. So this is the first point, which I think is actually, I wouldn't have taken it for granted. With the pandemic, many countries had a real inwards turn and started focusing on internal resilience and ignored or closed the doors to their neighbours and to international partners. The EU didn't. Although, of course, with the second pandemic, I'm not going to exclude that this might happen. The impact of the economic recession might mean that there won't be resources. But so far, it hasn't happened. Secondly, and this is connected actually to the post-pandemic recovery and how Europe has designed it, it has designed it to focus and invest on the digital economy and on the green economy. And I think the key question will be the degree to which European states involve their partners in designing projects that are cross-border to improve, for instance, investing in renewable energy in Morocco. These are projects that are out there that that attract the private sector. This is something that European resources, a mix of public and private resources, can actually help create, help sustain. And this is actually an area where Europeans could go to the US, to the next administration, saying, well, maybe we can work together, at least on economic cooperation and offering economic support and financial support to the countries in North Africa and the Middle East, which, you know, this is an area where there's scope for transatlantic cooperation. There has been in the past. It could be a good area for, you know, rebuilding that conversation across the Atlantic that has been missing in recent years. The other thing, well, and there's, of course, there is the, you know, it's connected to this, the ways in which the EU designs its aid tools and economic tools with third countries often include participation of citizens, of civil society groups, trade unions, etc. So I think there can still be a continuation, as I said, which has had hugely limited impacts, and we've all been very critical. But in some contexts, European support has been important. In, you know, even if it's just about supporting dialogues, as Jemana was mentioning. But for instance, in the case of Tunisia, Europeans have provided back in 2014 technical assistance for, you know, for the conversation on the constitution. These are things that can be done. There might be lower level. It's not geopolitics. It's not big politics. It's not. But it is about empowerment. It is about transferring knowledge. It is about transferring competencies. So this is something that can be continued. And then the final thing I'd like to mention is what I am observing from Brussels is that Europe has always looked at the Mediterranean as a lake with shores and has designed policies to embrace those shores. But now Europe is actually focusing a lot more on Africa, both in terms of economic opportunities and in terms as, you know, as a security challenge as well. And the way in which Europe looks at Africa is quite multifaceted, and if I may say so, more multifaceted than the way the US looks at Africa, which is more through the security lens. So in one respect, if you think about European humbleness and you know, being small with respect to the small and uninfluential with respect to the dynamics that have taken place in North Africa and the Middle East over the past decade at least. And if you think of the sort of forward-looking analysis about what the big trends are demographically, economically, migration-wise, etc. Well, the EU is thinking long rather than just about the Mediterranean. But of course, North Africa and the Middle East is part of that. And so when I say thinking long, it's thinking long term, but it's thinking long geographically as well. It's actually thinking about how to redesign a partnership with Africa. And North Africa would be part of that discussion. And there's, in fact, I mean, this is a detail. The financial instruments that the EU had towards North Africa and the Middle East, now they've been merged in one big financial instrument. They used to be separate, North Africa and the Middle East, and then the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa has all been merged into one big instrument. And I think that's indicative of how European institutions are rethinking the geography around them. So with, you know, post-pandemic push to diversify, supply chains, the push towards a green economy and therefore different, you know, raw material, critical materials, many of which are in the African continent. These economic changes will potentially reshape the relationship between European states and states in North Africa and the Middle East.
Thank you very much. On this note, Jemana, I would like to ask you the same question that I've asked to Ambassador Feldman a while ago, but would like it to be from the opinion and perceptions of the people in the MENA region on international organizations, on their work or lack of it, on their being functionally important for the people or being totally discredited?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, Ambassador Feldman is much more, you know, this is his area of expertise. So I obviously defer you to his initial comments, but from the, you know, the regional perspective, and I would want to actually build off something that Ambassador Feldman said actually when he answered his last question, which is, you know, the United States having principles and values, and even though we need to be much more modest about what we can and cannot do in the region. That doesn't mean that necessarily we make, you know, foes into friends. I mean, we need to be clear-eyed about who we're dealing with. But I think it is important to still have those principles and values that I think America does stand for, many of its allies also stand for, and and related to this, you know, question that the United Nations, you know, the United States played a major role in creating the United Nations. It also played a major role in, you know, spearheading the Nuremberg trials, which are now, you know, they have created the most important body of international criminal law that we have today. It played a critical role in, you know, spearheading the updates to the Geneva Conventions in 1949. And this wasn't just, you know, an intellectual exercise. It was meant to provide, you know, a civilized way of conflict resolution and preventing atrocities, you know, genocides from ever happening again. And there is value in the body of work that we and others put together, and in, you know, in the creation of the United Nations. And it saddens me that now the majority of many people in the region do not look, you know, to the United Nations as a sort, you know, as a peaceful way, or as a tool, as a resource to peacefully resolving any of the conflicts. It's unable to do that. We've seen even, you know, in terms of just being able to facilitate, for example, humanitarian aid. UN convoys were shot at in Syria in a very publicly, in front of the press, as they tried to reach besieged communities. We've seen this, you know, in terms of the multiple ineffective Geneva rounds, you know, that have tried to resolve the Syrian conflict 10 years on. You know, despite being on the Constitutional Committee, we still have not achieved anything. I mean, nothing tangible to, you know, to have any impact on the ground. The UN Security Council has been co-opted by Russia and China in many ways to achieve their own political aims in the region. And frankly, to use oftentimes US funding that goes to the United Nations to execute some of their, you know, their political objectives, like the money going through pressuring funding into Syria to go through UN Damascus, and knowing that Damascus and its allies have the final say on how that funding is being spent and distributed, and it's largely distributed to loyalist areas, further marginalizing the very same people who rose up against the Assad regime. You know, the UN's role in Lebanon, you can argue that, you know, UNIFIL, after 2006, its mandate was expanded to assist the Lebanese armed forces to prevent the presence of armed groups south of the Litani River. The intent was to remove Hezbollah from operating in this area, or at least preventing its weapons buildup. Of course, this never occurred. And part of Lebanon's problems today, you know, relate to this. Yemen also, you know, looking at just, you know, expanding a little bit, you said international organizations. So, you know, the role of international organizations in Yemen has been, you know, very delicate. They were prevented by the Houthis in many instances. You know, the Houthis attempted to charge them just to be able to distribute aid. INGOs there cannot speak frankly about any of the issues, let alone addressing them, you know, in terms of, for example, child marriage, child protection. I mean, the vocabulary alone is banned, let alone addressed. And so these are, you know, the society, when it looks at, you know, when it looks at these institutions, or the ineffectiveness and ability to address, to stop belligerent, you know, attacks and you know, major violations on human rights, they end up taking matters into their own hands, and we've seen the very real result of you know, what happens when that's the case. You end up devolving into now 10 years of civil war in some of these countries. So there is, deep distrust, disillusion, just disappointment with institutions that we, along with our, like-minded allies, 75 years ago now, really meant to act, we created to help address conflicts like these. And the reality is, as Ambassador Feltman said, is that they do need serious reforms. You didn't ask me what a Vice President Biden would do, but he has a history of co-sponsoring legislation on this back in his years in the Senate. In 1999, the Biden-Helms Act was meant to, push the UN to adopt reforms. And I hope that if we are to have a Biden presidency, that's something that we take the mantle up again, for again, like I think it's an issue that we have to address, and I think the United States should, and this is one thing that I think we can and should do, is play a role in taking a critical look at the United Nations, and what kind of necessary reforms are needed to make it effective again.
Thank you very much, Joanna. We are almost running out of time. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions. And one is exactly on Yemen. Regarding the war in Yemen and after the prisoners exchange, will this sign an agreement that will end the war? Joanna, you mentioned that, and of course the other two countries. What do you think about this question? What do you think about the Yemen as being a prototype of a policy done by international relations? Did you hear me, Joanna?
Yeah, no, it cut off a little bit, but was that question posed to me? I'm sorry.
Yes, because you mentioned Yemen, and there is one question on Yemen. One person is asking, regarding the war in Yemen and after the prisoners exchange, will this be a sign of an agreement that will end the war?
I'm not a Yemen specialist, so I don't think I'm properly, I'm not positioned, I think, to answer that question. I'd actually prefer to defer it to someone else on the panel, if you don't mind.
Okay. Rosa, Jeff, do you want to take it?
Sorry, I have to confess my ignorance. I can't talk about Yemen well beyond my comfort zone.
I guess that leaves me, and I'm hardly a Yemen expert either. So thank you, Rosa and Jomana. But I think that basically there are three wars in Yemen. There's a proxy war that's going on in Yemen. There's a Yemeni civil war that's very complex, lots of different actors, and there's the U.S. counterterrorism war going on in Yemen, and probably all of these wars are difficult to solve, but probably the proxy war is the least problematic to solve. Again, it's problematic, but even if you have some sort of understanding between the Houthis and their Iranian backers in Saudi Arabia, that's not going to end that's not going to end the Yemeni civil war. You're still going to have fights between the North and the South, fights between Islah and the Houthis in Maghreb and Jawf. I mean, you're going to have the STC in the South fighting with Hadi's government over who has more control in Aden. So I'm very pessimistic on Yemen right now because of the complexity of the landscape. What worries me is that that I could very well imagine the Saudis, who have, of course, the Saudi goals in Yemen were ostensibly to prevent a Hezbollah type entity from taking root in Yemen, to prevent cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia, which is perfectly understandable. Any government would want to do that, and to prevent Iranian from implanting roots in Yemen. And it's failed. In all of those aspects, the Saudi methods have made the problem worse. So I could imagine a scenario by which the Saudis come up with a way to leave in the same way that the UAE was able to extract itself mostly from the war, leaving the Houthis more or less in charge of large swaths of the country. And then we go back to all of the governance issues that Jomana was talking about, because the Saudis and the Houthis aren't going to care about respect for basic human rights in the parts of Yemen where the Houthis control. And so I don't think that you end the problem simply by ending the external part of the war. I'd like to, Karim, if I may, make a couple comments on Jomana's excellent review of why the region is disappointed, disillusioned with the UN, specifically the multilateral system more generally. And it's not just that region that's disillusioned with the UN. You can look at other parts of the world, global north, global south, et cetera, and find the same disillusionment, disappointment, cynicism about it. I was always struck during the 6 years I was Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, it's the highest ranking US citizen inside the UN for 6 years. It was a privileged position, but I was always struck as an American by two tensions, two unresolved tensions. One specifically American tension, the other more general. And the more general tension is that the UN is supposed to embody the ideals and the values that we as humanity bestowed in the Charter, in documents such as the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the UN is supposed to represent the best of us, all these ideals. But in fact, it's a member state organization where member states use it to pursue their national interests, which are not always in line with those ideals. And so there's a tension. And we see this in the Security Council continually over issues such as Syria, as Jomana so eloquently described. So that's one tension between the ideals the UN is supposed to represent and the reality that the member states control the organization. The other tension is an American tension, which is the US support for the United Nations, even though we were the primary creator, has always been tenuous. And it's been tenuous because it rests on a uncomfortable understanding. And that is that the US will voluntarily restrain the use of its overwhelming power in the name of international cooperation that the US cannot always control. And that has led, and of course, I'm not saying the US always lives up to the ideals either. The Iraq invasion in 2003 was a disaster and contrary to international law at many levels. But there is this idea that we will not do things that we have the power to do, that we may wish to do, in favor of global cooperation that we can't control, that we hope works in our interest. And these two tensions I saw playing out in practical ways throughout my tenure. And of course, it gets worse as the US has less and less ability to control that global cooperation because of the rise of China, because of the multipolarity, because of the disruptive role of a resurgent Russia have to play. Those are just my comments to Jomana, and I certainly concur with her sense of the disillusionment, disappointment, cynicism, because I heard it from our Middle East friends on all of my trips to the region, or when they came to New York to see me in my office.
Thank you very much. Do you have, Rosa and Jomana, to conclude? We ran out of time. So if you have some concluding remarks, a couple of things that you want to say that you haven't had the chance to say, please go ahead.
No, thank you for having us, Karim.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure, Mike. Thank you very much. It's been excellent. Thanks a lot. Have a great day, and I really hope sometime to be able to see you all in person, and not always with this computer in the middle. Thanks a lot, and good luck with your endeavors, wherever you are. Thanks.